I'm happy to be here with you to talk about the theme of this year's US COTS conference. I'm going to start out by saying, they're interesting times that we're in right at the moment. And I've learned, there's a lot of things that I've learned while I've been sheltering at home with the elderly. One of the things that I've learned is that I don't mind being told to stay home quite as much as I mind being called elderly. But other things that I've learned is don't cut your own bangs. I've also learned that Instacart shoppers are my new best friends. I've learned, and this is an important one, that if you change your screen name during a Zoom happy hour, remember to change it back before your next work-related meeting. And I've learned that hundreds of people are now quoting George Box, even if they don't know that they're quoting George Box. Early on one day, I heard all models are wrong, but some are useful, about 10 times in one day on CNN. And I also heard all models are wrong 3 times in one day on Fox News. They forgot the second part about some are useful, but oh well, that's just the way it is. I also asked some teachers that were in an ASA Zoom chat what they had learned while teaching at home while sheltering at home. Beth Benzing said, I don't have to collect paper ever again. Ruth Carver said students like to sleep in and noted that they're much more alert in the afternoon than they were in her 9 a.m. class and wondered if it was time to think about a later school start time. Amy Hogan noted students miss working with each other. Jamie Parrott said Zoom can equalize student contributions by giving each student kind of the same screen space. It can equalize things, which I thought was an interesting comment. Vicki Lyon said it's really important to keep in contact with students, and she also noted that it's really important to see their faces. And Chris Franklin noted that many students seem to be more engaged in remote instruction than they were in face-to-face instruction, and thinking that that might be because many students are more comfortable when they're in their own space. And I think of these last comments from these teachers as starting to get at the idea of engagement and that what they're learning about trying to engage students even in the current context that we're in. So I thought about engagement as kind of an engagement scale and decided to invent my engagement rating scale. And where the needle's pointing right now is where I kind of think we start with students at the beginning of a semester or quarter, where we've got students that are kind of trying to decide which is going to be more important for me to pay attention to what's going on in class or maybe what's going on my phone. It's kind of a 50-50 shot at that point. There are lots of things we can do to disengage students, and we end up at this end of the engagement scale rating. We hope we don't get there. It's really hard to recover from that once we're there. We would really hope that we're moving more in this direction where you can see in the picture at the top, we've got some students seem to be engaging, others not so much, but we're moving in the right direction. And as you move to the other pictures, you see that you see classroom environments where students are really engaged in the learning process. So when we talk about engagement, and as I said, that's the theme of the conference this year, I went to some dictionaries to look for the meaning of engagement. And the first definition that I came up with was occupy, attract, or involve, to participate or become involved in. And I think that says a little bit about what we're trying to do. But I'm bothered a little bit by the occupy, because I think we can occupy students without really engaging them in the way that we're talking about in this conference. Just because students are occupied, they can be occupied by a worksheet and doesn't really mean that they're necessarily engaging with the learning process. Other definitions I found that I liked a little bit better was engagement means to attract and hold fast. And then my favorite of the ones that I came across was that to engage someone means to interest them in something and to keep them thinking about it. And so that's kind of the meaning of engagement that I'm going to take moving forward through this talk. In looking at the literature and the research on student engagement and the interaction between student engagement and learning, you'll find a number of different models in the literature, and they identify different dimensions of engagement, often anywhere between 2 and 5. And I've kind of taken some of those and condensed them into the 2 that I want to talk about in this particular talk. The first is intellectual or cognitive engagement. You'll see those terms used interchangeably in the research literature. And intellectual engagement is characterized by engagement in the learning process, students showing a willingness to exert effort and to persevere in solving a problem, students who look for different ways to solve a problem, especially if they're not successful with their first attempt. And it's also characterized by student interest and curiosity. And there's quite a bit of research in mathematics and statistics education now that supports the conclusion that there is a positive relationship between student intellectual engagement and student learning, which isn't surprising when you look at how we characterize intellectual engagement. A second dimension that I'm going to look at is actually combining a couple of dimensions that other people have described, and I'm going to call this social and cultural engagement. And social and cultural engagement is characterized by, has a social side, which would include student-student interactions, a classroom environment that is welcoming, where students feel a sense of belonging, and a place where kind of creating a classroom environment where learning is enjoyable and learning is fun. There's also another aspect of social and cultural engagement that I'm calling relevance here, and that is where instruction, that's characterized by instruction that really relates to students' life experiences, their interests, and their personal aspirations. And again, there's a fair amount of research that backs up the conclusion that social and cultural engagement increases students' motivation to learn, as well as increasing knowledge acquisition and knowledge retention. Now, I know that there are a lot of people, when we just describe the, making a classroom that is where it's enjoyable and fun, I know that there are some who think, it's not my job to entertain students, and it's not my job to make sure that students are having fun. But that then begs the question, as teachers of statistics, then what is our job? Now I can put out here as one possibility, our job is to tell students everything that we know. But I would again argue now that that's probably not what our job is, especially now in the days of Wikipedia and Google. Where there's a lot that students can just find if the goal is just to try and tell them what we know. So I would argue that our job as teachers of statistics is really to facilitate student learning, and not just to convey information or tell them what we know. And the research is pretty clear in both statistics education and mathematics education, and then also research in other disciplines as well. It supports the conclusion that student learning and student achievement is really related to these various aspects of engagement. All right, so if we view fostering student learning as one of our goals and recognize that engagement is important, what can we do as instructors to foster the kind of engagement that the research really indicates leads to enhance student learning? And I'm going to talk about 4 aspects that I think really do or can be leveraged to foster engagement. And these are context, connections, communication, and commitment. Now, before I get started on these, though, I do want to insert here an important note about active learning. interaction with learning activities is important. And somebody said, I don't know who said this, but it sounds like something that George Cobb might have said, but I'm not sure. But learning is not a spectator sport. And that, I think, is primarily why lectures often not the best teaching strategy, even if we try and make our lectures enjoyable and entertaining. I point out here, I don't know why I seem to like basketball analogies, but I can enjoy watching basketball, but I can't learn to play by watching basketball. And so incorporating well-designed learning activities is one way that we can actually foster student engagement, both intellectual engagement and also student engagement, as long as these activities are well-designed learning activities that have that really do engage students in the learning process. So we're not talking about here, some people think of learning activities are things like worksheets where students work on worksheets, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking really about active and engaged learning activities. So there are many sessions in this conference and in past conferences that really have addressed active learning pedagogies and the importance of active activity-based learning in the statistics classroom. And so for that reason, I've chosen to kind of focus on other things in this talk, but I want to make it clear that, please don't interpret this as meaning that I don't think active learning is important and key to engaging students. I just think that territory has been covered and will be covered in many of the other sessions. All right, so starting with context, if we go back to my 4 C's, I guess I would call them. There's a lot of research. I keep referring back to the research because I think it's important to note that these are not just personal beliefs or opinions, but they are supported by research. And there is a lot of research in statistics education and mathematics education and more generally that supports the conclusion that student engagement is enhanced when that learning occurs in a context that students find relevant, either relevant to their own lives or to their personal aspirations, what they hope to achieve or to do in the future, and that by structuring learning so that it occurs in a context that students find interesting and meaningful, it then allows students to view the learning as worthy of their effort, trying to make what they're doing work worth doing. And so context, I think in this way, learning in context can contribute to both intellectual engagement and also the social and cultural engagement as well. So what are some strategies that we might want to think about as instructors that are related to this idea of context? And I think here the main overarching theme here is that we want to make it meaningful, and borrowing a phrase from the Common Core for K-12, the standards for K-12 mathematics, we want to make it work worth doing, or that students see that it's work worth doing. Sometimes we see it as work worth doing, but the students don't make that connection there. So we want to make it work that's worth doing. And so some strategies, and some of these are tried and true, using real rather than contrived context. I remember once opening a textbook that we were looking at adopting and the first exercise I looked at started out as if you and 5 of your friends were in a Mexican jail. And I thought, this is not what I want to be having students try and convince students that this is something that's relevant and important and that they should be learning. So real context versus contrived context. I'm also a big believer in real data, and I know that sometimes real data is hard to come by. And so often we do realistic data, but I also want to throw in there that realistic data, to me, it's important to make sure that if we're making up realistic data in a real context, that it's important that we create that data to be such that it supports the conclusions that would be drawn from the real data. Because one of my fears in teaching statistics, if I make up data, is that students remember something that's incorrect in the applied context just because I made up data about whether eating apricots will help relieve arthritis symptoms. And so, you know, I don't want them to walk away thinking, oh, you know, I should tell my elderly aunt to start eating apricots. So I think there's a danger in slapping a real context onto artificial data. And if I do go for the realistic data, I try and generate data from summary statistics that might have been published in a way that ensures that if students use that data to carry out an analysis, that they will reach the same conclusions that were originally supported by the data. And then I also would you know, would point out that current data is important. I think if I were to still teach, even though I started using real data early on in my career, if I were to be using those same examples, some of the context and the data that I would be using would now be from 10 to 15 years before my current students were even born. And again, it's hard for them to see relevance when the reference date is, you know, 1997. So anyway, so I would encourage think about the need for current data and to keep current in what we're doing in class. Another point to make here is that sometimes choosing contexts that are relevant and have broad appeal, but that at the same time avoid contexts that might actually interfere or disrupt learning because they're sensitive for some students, things like depression or immigration status, that requires some very careful thought. And this is something that Beth Chance pointed out to me as we were talking about some of the ideas in terms of engaging students. And so it's really hard sometimes to kind of walk that fine line in terms of making it relevant for students, but at the same time not treading into contexts that may be difficult or sensitive for some students. The other strategy is just ask students what they're interested in. I found some luck with saying, you know, gee, you know, in the coming weeks, we're going to be starting to look at inference. We could do that in the context of, you know, of climate change and the environment, or we could do that in the context of, you know, medical advances for some disease, you know, and just ask them what context would you like to pursue, and then tailor my my examples to something that they have asked for. I found that what I'm interested in, especially the older I get, the things that I find interesting are not necessarily the same things that my students find interesting. And so one strategy is just to ask them, especially where you know, where you have some flexibility in what's coming up, to tailor your examples or exercises to that. Another thing that I've been really enamored with recently is the development of what are called choose a path types of homework problems. And you probably notice that in, you know, like when you get to hypothesis testing in your introductory statistics class, that we tend to ask students to do the same kinds of things with, you know, in different contexts. And so we're starting to see the development of some questions where you know, the parts A, B, C, D, and E for an exercise are all the same, but that allow students to pick one of 4 or 5 different contexts and data sets, and allows them to choose which of those they're going to pursue to do that particular exercise. So all students are doing the same thing, but they may be doing it in different contexts and with different data sets that they find that they have chosen as a possibility. responsibility. And so that while that takes some work to set those kinds of exercises up, you might be able to leverage it by using the same kinds of data sets at different places during the course. Another example which I thought was interesting is with the change in DataFest, and UCLA just finished hosting its first ever remote data fest. And rather than giving students a single data set for them to work on, what Rob Gould at UCLA asked them to do is to have each team choose something related to the COVID-19 outbreak, but not medical. So to find some data and to use that data to illustrate the impact of COVID-19 on something other than medical. And so I think that's a really interesting idea, because it gave them the opportunity to look at either education or transportation or just anything that they might be interested in, and again allow them to pick a context which was meaningful to them. The other thing that I tried, this was at the sort of toward the end, and I haven't had a chance because I've been retired now for a number of years to pursue this further, but I did have students write, so starting with a homework problem that I had assigned with a data set and asked them to do parts A, B, C, D, and E. Then the second part of their homework was that students had to write an exercise to find a context and some data, and write an exercise that kind of asked for the same kinds of analysis that I had asked for in the problem that I had assigned. And then I put these together into a student written problem bank that I used as part of the review homework. And so I had about 35 problems in this problem bank, and as part of a review homework assignment, each student had to pick 3 of them to do as their kind of practice and review, and students were not allowed to pick a problem that they had written, but the way they got points on this is that they got a point for every student that picked the problem they had written to do as part of their homework assignment. So it was kind of a little bit of a competition, and I ended up with some really great kind of a bank of really good problems on topics that students themselves were interested in. So that may be something to think about in terms of something that you might be interested in pursuing. And then kind of continuing along the context under the Make It Meaningful, Make It Work Worth Doing strategy, I asked a number of teachers when I was working on textbooks, what kinds of examples are your students interested in? And this is the advice I got from teachers. And so this is a kind of always my fallback if I can't come up with something else. Teachers tell me that students are interested in animals, the environment, and themselves. And so if in doubt, you can always go to something, to a context involving one of these 3 things. I discovered the Journal of College Student Development as a result of pursuing this, and have found a number of examples in that journal that have worked well with students. Other examples, Beth pointed me toward to the International Statistical Literacy Project's Pro-Civic Stats that has some really interesting data sets and contexts. Tuva Labs is another favorite of mine. Tuva Labs is just a curator of data sets, and they have a number of interesting contexts, and they continually update their data sets. So I would encourage you to look at those. Another thing that people often talk about in terms of context that's interesting to students is projects, where they allow students to pick their own project topics. I think that is also that's good, but I don't think that should be the only strategy we rely on for making things meaningful for students, because that tends to be late in the term, and is certainly not something that would engage students early on. And then just to provoke, George Cobb, who we miss you, George. He always encouraged us to provoke. I think that we can rethink content, and this is something that Beth Chance also mentioned in my discussions with her. We can rethink the content of the introductory course. And what does that have to do with context? Well, sometimes I find myself struggling to find a current, meaningful, relevant example to illustrate some method or some type of graphical display. And so my thought is that if I can't find an interesting and relevant example, should I even be teaching it? And so does it need to be part of our curriculum? So I would encourage you to kind of think about that in the context of context and engaging students. All right, the second of my C's is connections, and I'm going to go back for a minute to the research in stat education. And there's, again, a lot of evidence that supports the conclusion that student learning is enhanced when they can relate what they're learning to either prior knowledge or their own personal experiences or their personal aspirations. Prior knowledge might include their knowledge from other disciplines as well, as you saw in the workshop that just preceded this one, looking at linking statistical knowledge to what they're learning in the context of biology. And so that's one aspect of connections, being able to connect to prior knowledge and their own interests and personal aspirations. There's also another aspect of connections that relates to engagement, and that's the research that kind of tells us that integrating opportunities for social connections, and by social connections I mean both student-faculty connections but also student-student interaction, to make sure that we integrate opportunities for this in the learning process, both inside and outside the classroom, because much of the learning in our courses actually goes on outside the classroom. And all of these kinds of things can be beneficial in terms of student learning. And I think it certainly contributes to the idea of social engagement and cultural engagement, but also if these, the way that we integrate these interactions into our class, it also provides an opportunity to engage students intellectually as well. So strategies, some strategies related to connections. I think what we just need to do is think very carefully as we put our courses together, and that we create opportunities for what I'm calling productive interaction. We all probably have had classes where there's been plenty of student-student interaction, maybe more than we would have liked, that wasn't productive in the sense of engaging students in the learning process. So create opportunities for productive interaction. One example, one of the things that I've always like to do is to have short kind of focusing activities at the beginning of class that can produce discussion and interaction. And so examples of these focusing activities, and they just take a few minutes at the beginning, where you have students in small groups look at a set of terms or graphs or concepts or and ask questions like, what's missing? Here's a set of 4 terms. Is there a 5th term that ought to be in here that isn't there? So what's missing? What doesn't belong? If you put something in your list that is at odds with the other things, what doesn't belong? What do these things have in common? What's wrong with this picture? Another favorite of mine is the ongoing collaboration between the New York Times and the American Statistical Association called What's Going On with This Graph, where each week they post a graph that appeared in the New York Times and ask students to think about, what do you notice, from looking at this graph, what do you notice and what do you wonder? Excuse me. And there's now, they've been doing this now for a number of years, and so there's a wonderful archive of graphical displays suitable for teaching about statistics, ideas, and concepts that you can find there. And so one strategy is, I know a number of teachers are using this as a classroom starter, just showing a graph and asking the questions about what do you notice, what do you wonder, and what would you, where would you go from here to answer the questions that you pose in the what do you wonder. And so I think that things like this can foster both the intellectual engagement and of course social engagement. But the hard part is making sure that these interactions are productive, that they're also something that has a learning component to them, not just a social component there. The other thing that I thought of in terms of strategies related to connections is that we can think about fostering social and cultural engagement when we're doing classroom examples by asking questions of our students like, what surprised you about this example? What did you find most interesting? Do you have any experience with this in your life? How do you see yourself using this? And one that I like in particular is, what's another situation where this method could be used to answer a question that you might be interested in? Because sometimes what students say here gives, I leave the classroom, and make notes, about what they said here, because these are really suggestions for future contexts for examples and so on. So I think, again, these can contribute both to intellectual engagement and also social engagement. Moving on to the third of the C's, we've got communication. Good communication is essential for social engagement and also for fostering intellectual engagement and cultural engagement. I think that we just need to make sure that we understand that communication is a two-way street, or maybe I should be a three-way street, because I ended up with three things what I hear. But we have to think about how we as faculty communicate with our students, but we also need to think about how our students communicate with us as faculty. I think sometimes we don't spend enough time listening to our students, or we don't listen to our students carefully enough. And so that's something that I always, am trying to work on. And then, of course, the student interaction in the learning environment, in the context of the learning environment, is important as well. Strategies related to communication. Well, I think it's particularly important to pay attention to communication, these communication aspects, especially in large classes, and now that almost all of us are teaching online as well. I think we want to make sure that we give students the opportunity to talk statistics and to reflect on what they're learning. And that can be done in large classes, and it can be done online. You just have to get creative about how you engage students in talking statistics. And I think that, again, this should be something that we encourage throughout the course, not just something that we say, oh, well, they're going to be able to do this when they do an oral presentation of their project at the end of the term, but trying to get them to talk statistics throughout the course. We can also look at in communication in kind of increasing student engagement through communication by providing opportunities for group work and thinking about what role collaborative learning and service learning might play in our courses. If we haven't already kind of incorporated some of that, would be a good thing to think about with respect to engagement. And then we want to, another kind of something related to communication is how we communicate with students through the questions that we ask them. I think we need to ask students questions that challenge them and that at the same time guide their thinking, because I really believe that low-level superficial questioning really can cause interest to fade, and deeper learning doesn't happen. And the best advice that I could give is stolen from Alan Rossman, who has always said, that what we need to do as instructors is ask good questions. And I would point you to his remarkable and engaging blog at askgoodquestions.blog. He has been doing weekly posts on the issue of asking good questions in class, and I think that there's a lot of good advice in those blog posts that are particularly relevant to issues of engaging students in the classroom. And then I think, we need to do what we can to provoke conversations, but in a friendly way. It's hard sometimes to get students to have conversations and to communicate with each other. And I think there are things we can do along those lines. And finally, my last of the C's is commitment. And I think that we would all say that we know that students' commitment is important, and that if students will take ownership of the learning process, that is important, and really increases their learning as well. But I also would say that faculty commitment is also important. And so I think that we need to think about motivating and challenging ourselves to look for ways to engage with students and their learning. I think that teacher engagement creates student engagement. And I put here vice versa, because we all know, we've all had classes where, where the students are particularly engaged and excited about what they're learning, and we know that that energy carries over to us as well. And so I think we need to think about the transfer from us to students as being there as well. So think about what you're passionate about, bring that into the classroom. I think passion and excitement can be contagious, and when I talk about contagious these days, I have to say in this context, contagious is a good thing. And when I think about the ability to bring passion and excitement, I always think about Tom Short, who was a master at doing this. He brought his excitement into the classroom when we would do workshops with teachers, and they couldn't help but get excited about the things that Tom was excited about, because he just conveyed that particular energy. And Tom, along with George, is somebody that we've lost over this last year, and who will also be missed. So talked a little bit about this, but if we're going to be honest, there are some cons. If we're going to work on these things, there is a greater faculty burden. It does require more planning and preparation, and actually probably a lot more planning and preparation. And it requires us to think about what's going on outside the classroom as well, and try and think about managing the learning that's occurring outside the classroom. And there are some implications for demands on class time, to incorporate some of these things. But, I would say it's all in the service of student learning. And after all, that is our job, is to create an environment that's conducive to student learning. In closing, I want to talk a little bit about a blog post that I read just recently. Well, it actually was in a newsletter, the Global Math newsletter, appeared on May 5th, and I've put the link in here, and I would encourage you to take a look at this, because it really spoke to me as I was starting to think about this talk. And it was written by a math educator who's now at home with her 4th grader, and she talked about her daughter's visible frustration, dislike, and anger every time she had to log on to Google Classroom for her math lesson. And the mom said she felt her anger and frustration build because she could see strategies that she would use to try and teach this, but that in the end it always just deteriorated into just trying to get her daughter to get through the darn worksheet and end the angst of the math lesson. But she says one day her daughter just was, in her free online time, asked if she had seen this coronavirus tracker. That this math educator was in Canada, and she said her 4th grade daughter showed her this coronavirus tracker, and she said her first reaction was, no, I don't want to, I'm done with, I don't want to even think about this virus, this thing that's ruining my life. But she thought, well, I should humor my daughter, and she looked at this, and she was amazed because her daughter, remember, is in 4th grade and has never worked with numbers this large, but her daughter, kind of was able to talk through the comparison that she was seeing here. And then, much more to her amazement, her daughter showed her this graph and interpreted what she was seeing in this graph about what was going on in the different provinces in Canada. And then went on to show her this. Now, this is a 4th grader, and to interpret what she was seeing in this graph, paying particular attention to the labels on the axes even. And she comments that she was really amazed at the depth of understanding that her daughter had been able to develop on her own because of her engagement with this particular context. And she said her closing comment was that this was a reminder that we don't need to force learning, because children and grown-ups will learn about things that interest them when they're ready. And so I'd like you to, to think about that, and to go back to my question about, as teachers of statistics, what is our job? We can't force learning, as the math educator I was just referring to mentioned, but at the same time, we can't just sit back and wait for students to learn. And so I think that, we also can't just create student learning by telling them everything we know. I heard the phrase lecturing at the board, and I think sometimes this is what happens, is we're lecturing at the board, and that's not a typo. I think what our job is, our real job, is to create opportunities for student learning and the development of conceptual understanding for all students. And to be successful in that endeavor, I think we need to think very carefully about engaging everyone, the theme of this particular conference. So I'd like to thank you for attending this session. I hope you enjoy the rest of eCOTS, and because there's many great workshops, breakout sessions, and things that I think will engage you and provide lots of food for thought. Encourage you to stay safe and carry on. And then I would be open for questions or other thoughts if we have a few minutes.
Yes, we have about 18 minutes or so. So thank you very much. This was very thought-provoking. I have lots of ideas already. And we do have some questions coming in. One of those questions was, you mentioned a journal that you asked some individuals, what types of questions the students all like, and you said animals, the environment, and themselves, and that you got a lot of examples from this particular journal. What was that?
It was called the Journal of College Student Development. And so that fits under the themselves part of the what
Right.
students are interested in. And I also made my nephew, who was at the time a college freshman, I made him sit down and look at examples that I had produced and tell me which ones he thought were interesting and which ones he didn't. And he was tentative at first, going, well, I don't know how she's going to react. And he said, well, he was, said, well, I think this is interesting, but I'm kind of a nerd and my friends might not find it. And eventually he got to where he said, yeah, that one's good, but that one's lame. So, and those are the ones I replace. So.
Yeah, it's good to get that feedback. Sometimes it's hard to know.
Yeah.
So I have another question here. So I love these ideas that challenge students to move to another context, like the question bank competition under context, and the where else might this be important communication exercise. How do you assess whether students are gaining that understanding of the value of statistical ideas under multiple contexts?
Well, I think it is important to include multiple contexts. The reasons I like those kinds of questions, though, is that we have diverse students in our classrooms, and finding there's no surefire way to find a context that every student will engage in. So I do try and use a wide variety of contexts where possible, but making students think about, okay, I wasn't all that interested in this particular context, but then having them say, okay, kind of forcing them to grapple with, okay, well, I wasn't really interested there, but, where might I be interested, in? And so it kind of makes them take it from a context that I've chosen and relates it to their particular interests and aspirations. And then it gives me, like I said, great ideas for other contexts that I can use in homework problems, exam questions, future examples.
So, next question. Roxy, you have had a fantastic career. How have you involved with students evolving to engage them over your career?
Well, so that I think that's a polite way of saying you're really old, which I agree. But yeah, I mean, I think that there were several, several points for me. I mean, I started teaching at Cal Poly in, 1908, early on. I think I went there in 1979, and I was just, I mean, I was out of the environment where you lectured, and I thought I got to be a very, the point where I was a good lecturer, and students, if I didn't ask them too much in the way of anything conceptual, which I wasn't really even thinking about then anyway, it was more, procedural, looking at procedural fluency. And then I visited actually a 2-year college in California, in Bakersfield, that had just built a studio classroom where they were trying to integrate activities and integrate lecture and lab together. And we had started exploring studio classrooms in our sciences. And it got me thinking about how could I create that kind of environment in a statistics class. And that kind of started kind of my interest in looking at activity-based learning and trying to engage students through activities. And I just found that even though that was a lot of work at the beginning, I went to an early workshop by Dick Schaefer, who, if you come back for the tribute to George Cobb later this afternoon, Dick will be on for a few minutes where we're going to talk about how George impacted us. But I went to a workshop on when Dick Schaefer first wrote his book Activity-Based Learning, and thought, wow, this could be really fun, and I could see how I could get students to be having fun but at the same time learning, as opposed to just activities that ask them to do something for activity's sake. And so that was a turning point. And then interactions over the years, I've worked with on a couple of projects with George Cobb, who's always provocative and asking us to question what we're doing. And it kind of got me in that mindset. And I found that I found teaching to be more of a challenge, but also much more rewarding as a consequence of making those changes.
So, another question, have you thought about using online gaming for data sets? I'm thinking of using a gaming app and use output of the data such as points scored.
Yeah, I haven't personally, but I think that would be something, especially if you have kind of traditional age students. I think that's something that they would be interested in. And I think the closest thing I've ever done is using the guessing correlations thing where they get scored, and they had a leaderboard at one time. I don't know if they still do, but they had a leaderboard where it's the top 10 at the current time. And I had told students, well, if you ever make it into the top 10, then you get 5 extra points, just trying to get them to engage with that more outside of class. And I even had a student who took a screen capture and emailed me at like 2 in the morning, because he wanted to he knew that by the time he told me he had made the next day, he wouldn't be, he would have moved out. But so I think they are there. I think that it's figuring out how to use that kind of competitive nature, but in a productive way, not making students compete with each other to the I win, you lose, but to that kind of friendly competition. Like that problem bank worked out really well, because they really wanted to write a good question because they wanted other students to pick their question. So
with that, did you find that they kind of all gravitated towards one type of problem, or did they kind of get a mix of different problems that were selected?
Well, so I did it in the context of a review for particular. So I actually kind of dictated the methods that had to be used, and what I was asking them to do is invent the context and the question that was posed, to use those. But toward the end of the course, you could actually open it up to more of a free-for-all, in terms of a broader, where you wouldn't dictate the methods. But yeah, I wanted to be kind of fair footing. I didn't want somebody to have a really easy to do one, from descriptive statistics competing with a multiple regression one at the end of the term, because I know which one students might tend to pick just because of that. So.
Right. So this relates to engagement for everyone. Do you have advice for promoting engagement of all when students vary to a great degree in readiness and aptitude for learning the data statistics subject matter?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of work being done in that space now. I think we're still learning about that as there have been big changes in California and pretty much throughout the nation with respect to developmental education and the developmental math. What do you do with students who don't place into directly into statistics? And I think that there's just a lot of really strong evidence now that supports these having a co-requisite course that runs alongside the statistics course and provides students who need who might be underprepared in terms of their mathematical background, gives them kind of that support alongside. It's showing great success, not just in the intro stat course but also in follow-on course. That those students also don't just get through intro stat, but they also tend to do well in their other GE science courses and other courses that use mathematical methods. So I think that's something that we're still learning a lot about, but I think that there's I think trying to write there. In fact, I think the person that's giving the very next talk is Elena Umfred.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and she's done a lot of work too with trying to create, I don't know if that's what she's going to be talking about in her talk, but I heard she gave a talk at JSM about creating examples and with multiple entry points, where students can kind of enter into the problem at different points depending on where they are and how much help they need getting to to kind of where you want them to be. So she might have something to say about about that question as well.
Or if not, she's a good point of contact. If you want to discuss it further, yeah.
Yeah, she's done a lot of work at CSU Monterey Bay and had really nice success with integrating students that, of coming up with a really good classroom experience for students that's starting at a variety of different levels.
So speaking about that classroom experience, so any suggestions on getting other teachers on board with active learning, especially in higher education? There seems to be a resistance to moving away from lecturing at the board.
Yeah, and that's been going on for a while. One of my favorite stories is I have a cousin, a much younger cousin, but who was going to school at BYU, and told me he had just finished his statistics course and with Rex Bryce, who's a friend who I had known for a long time but had never seen teach. And he had just finished telling me how much he had learned and how much he enjoyed the class, and he was thinking about doing a minor in statistics. And I said, well, how did you like Rex as a teacher? How was he as a teacher? And he said, well, he didn't really teach. And I said, okay, sit down right now. And I said, and he had just told me how much he had learned. And I said, what he did was much harder than lecturing. And so getting away trying to get people to recognize that if you're not lecturing, that doesn't mean you're not teaching. And, one thing that I've, talked to a couple of people about is, when people think you're not teaching, they think that because your students are successful that you just have lowered your standards. And one way to explore that is to think about trying to get an agreement to just one or two common questions on final exams. And there are questions that I think everybody can agree on are things that we would hope our students would be able to do, especially on the conceptual level. You can just assume they're getting there if you never ask them. But when you do ask them, I think that's been an eye opener for many people that rely on lecture only. That they're making a lot of assumptions about what students are learning and understanding. And when they see that kind of an activity-based approach can be as effective in terms of getting students up to speed in terms of procedural fluency, but at the same time more effective in terms of developing conceptual understanding, then they have to kind of, at least you may not convince them, but at least they quit bugging you.
Yeah, I know some of the most eye-opening things I've done is just listen to students work through a problem, and I really learn how much they don't know or can't explain, which is what, of course, we want them to be able to do.
Yeah.
So, and we did hear from Elena, and she is going to be talking about this. It's how we address classroom social inequities after moving to a co-requisite course model. So it fits in perfectly.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Great. All right, let's, so I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. Okay, so here's a good one. So they're all good ones, but this one. So thanks for sharing your ideas and experience, Roxy. Can you recall the most meaningful experience for your students or in your teaching?
Oh gosh. I mean, there've been. I think it's just, you know, that when I first started incorporating more of this kind of learning, I allowed students a lot more flexibility in terms of their projects and moved to kind of poster presentations and really allowed them to bring their creativity as well as their statistical knowledge, their creativity to their projects and presentations. And I was just amazed at what students would would do if you let them engage not just with the statistics knowledge, but also let them bring their creativity in other areas to the game. And then the next quarter, I had somebody who came up to me at the beginning and said, "Oh, I signed up for your section because I hear we get to do a project." And I just went, "Oh, okay." And I'd been doing projects all along, but I hadn't been doing projects in a way that really let students kind of shine in other ways as well. So
very interesting to think the project. Yeah,
that was, I just went, "Oh wow." I was like, "Well, okay, I guess I'll let you stay." So.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Roxy, for a wonderful hour. We really appreciate all of your ideas that you have shared with us.